Okay guys, today we're adding and subtracting fractions and mixed numbers, and the one rule that you have to remember is that the denominators must match before you add or subtract. You cannot move forward unless they match, and there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. One's a really easy way that might cost you a little bit of work in the long run. The other one's a little more simpler, but you have to think it through before you start. So if they match, they're really easy. 3/8 plus 2/8 equals 5/8, and the one thing that you have to remember on mixed numbers is you have to remember to include the mixed number. So 1 1/4 plus 1 1/4. A lot of times people will just go ahead and they'll add those two fractions up and they'll get 2/4 and they'll say, well, that's my answer, I'll simplify it, and it equals 1/2. Well, you've got 1 1/4 and you're adding another 1 1/4 to it. Is your answer reasonable? Is it logical to say that you can get an answer of 1/2 when you're starting out with more than that to begin with and you're adding more to it? So no, it's not logical. You have to remember to add both of these whole numbers into that as well, and you end up with 2.5 as your answer. So always remember to carry those whole numbers over throughout your problem so you don't forget it in the answer, because that is very important with mixed numbers. And then go back and look at your answer. Does it make sense? Is it reasonable to have 2.5 when you're adding those together? Yeah, it sure is. So that's what you have to remember on mixed numbers. Always remember to add that mixed number back into it. Now, as far as fractions that don't have the same denominator, they have uncommon denominators, a couple different things you can do here. Now, the most common method is to multiply this side of the fraction by this denominator, which is a 2, and multiply this side of the fraction by the denominator of 4, because it's over here, cross multiplication. It can be done this way. Whatever you do to the denominator, you also do to the numerator. So if I'm multiplying this side of the fraction by 2, I've got 2 times 4, and that's 8. 2 times 3 is 6. And I'm multiplying this side of the fraction by 4. 2 times 4 is 8, so my denominators do match. And 4 times 1 is 4. Now you add those up, the denominator stays the same. The denominator never changes. You don't add those together. So the 8 is still the denominator. 4 plus 6 is 10 over 8. 10 over 8 means I have more than 1. That's an improper fraction. You never leave your answer as an improper fraction or as an unsimplified fraction. Fractions always go in simplest form, and so you always want to have it in simplest form. And the way you think about that is you divide 8 into 10. How many times does 8 go into 10? It goes in there once. 8 times 1 is 8. Subtract. You get 2. And then the 2 comes up as the numerator. So you have 1 2/8. Well, 2/8 is not in simplest form because they're both even numbers. And if you remember the divisibility rules, 2 will go into both of those. So you still have your whole number of 1. Divide 2 by 2 is 1, and divide 8 by 2 is 4. That is your final answer. That's a lot of steps. There's a simpler way that you can do this. If you just take a little bit of time and look ahead, instead of doing all the cross multiplication, let me erase some of this. I'm going to erase this. Let's look and see if we can make a common denominator from what we have instead of cross multiplying both sides. I can make a 2 of 4 by multiplying by 2. So instead of multiplying both sides, I'm just going to multiply this side of the fraction, numerator and denominator, by 2. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. I'm going to add that into this, and I get 3/4. And when I add those up, I get 5/4. Now, you still get an improper fraction, but it should be in simplest form by the time you change it from an improper fraction into a mixed number. And so I'm going to divide 4 into 5. I've got one group. 4 times 1 is 4. Subtract. I get 1 1/4. And that is in simplest form because I've got 1 as a numerator. So that always means it's in simplest form. So that's the easier way to do that. If you can change only one fraction, I recommend you do that. Now, some people want to go ahead and multiply both sides, and that's perfectly okay. Just remember you're going to have a little bit more work when it comes to simplifying the fraction. No improper fractions as final answers, and always in simplest form. Let's look at subtraction, because that's a little bit tricky, especially if we have to regroup. And let's say I have 1 7/8 minus 5/8. We'll start off simple. Okay? The denominators are already the same, no big deal. 7 minus 5 is 2. The denominator stays the same. Don't forget about your whole number up here, because really what you're saying is 1 7/8 minus 0 5/8. So 1 minus 0 is 1, and then you do have to simplify that. You get 1 1/4. So that's what you do if you don't have to regroup. Always remember to include your whole number. Now let's change this around a little bit. I'll use the same problem, but I will reorder it. I'll say 1 5/8 minus 7/8. Now, what you're saying here is you are subtracting 7 from 5. We're not dealing with integers or negative numbers at this point, so if you only have 5, there's no way you can take away 7 from it. But I have a whole number here. So just like you would borrow and regroup in a regular subtraction problem, I'm going to borrow and regroup from this whole number. So if I borrow 1 whole, this becomes a 0. I'm borrowing that 1 whole, but it does me no good to just put a 1 there. I need to borrow that as a fraction form, and I'm already in eighths. So what I'm really doing is I am borrowing 8/8. Alright, 1 whole is 8/8 because we have the denominator of 8. So I want to keep everything in eighths. So I'm borrowing that 1 whole. Now I'm going to rewrite my problem, because I'm adding those 8/8 to the 5/8. And 8 plus 5 is 13/8 minus 7/8. Now I can take away 7 from 13. That's no problem at all. I can do that problem. And you notice with subtraction, I usually write them vertically. It's a little bit easier with subtraction, especially if you have to regroup, to write your problems vertically as opposed to horizontally. So I'm going to take away 7 from 13, and I get 6/8. Always take a look at your answer, and don't just say, okay, I'm finished, move on to the next one. Let's always look and see, is it in simplest form? Ask those questions. Is it an improper fraction? Always make sure, because it makes the difference between a right or a wrong answer. So we know that both of these numbers are even numbers, so they're divisible by 2. So I'm going to divide numerator and denominator by 2. All right, 6 divided by 2 is 3. 8 divided by 2 is 4. This is in simplest form as 3/4, and you know that because they are next door neighbors. 3 over 4. 4 comes after 3, so they are next door neighbors. It is in simplest form. You are totally finished. You go back and look and make sure, does it make sense? You had you had a little bit less than 2, but 1 5/8 is a little bit less than 2. Actually a little bit more than 1 1/2. And here you're almost taking 1 away from it, because 7 parts of 8 is almost 1 whole. You ended up with a fraction, no whole number. That is a reasonable answer. So that one makes sense. Hopefully you can remember these rules. Remember, the main thing is denominators must be the same. They must match. You have to change them. You can change either one or both, but they do have to match. And when you subtract, you are borrowing a whole group. Whatever that fraction is, keep it the same, and add that to whatever you started with, fraction you started with. You remember these rules, and you should do pretty well. So we'll work on this in class. Hopefully this is a good review or an intro for 5th graders to adding and subtracting fractions and mixed numbers.